Your Honor, let's be realistic. She's never worked a real job in her life. She has no skills, no prospects. Frankly, she'll never amount to anything on her own. That's what my husband of 19 years said about me, under oath, to a judge, while I sat 8 feet away and listened. He said it to pay me less. And it worked. I walked out of that courthouse with a teenage daughter, $400, and those words burned into me like a brand. That was 12 years ago. Last month, an application landed on the desk of a property manager who works for me, a man wanting to rent a 1-bedroom in a building I own. The manager flagged the name out of habit, because it matched the name on my own paperwork from years back. Greg Merrick, my ex-husband, applying to rent an apartment from a company he doesn't know I own, from a woman he swore, under oath, would never amount to anything. He had no idea whose signature was on the deed. That's the thing about men like Greg. They never check. Let me take you back, because a moment like that only means something if you understand the 19 years that built up to it. My name is Nora. I met Greg when I was 20, in my second year of nursing school, and he was everything I thought confidence was supposed to look like. Older, polished, already making money in commercial real estate, the kind of man who walked into a restaurant and had the table before he asked. I was a girl from a small town whose mother cleaned motel rooms, and when a man like that decided he wanted me, I mistook the wanting for love. A lot of us do. That's not stupidity. That's just being young and hungry to be chosen. The control started so slowly I couldn't have named it if you'd asked. First it was practical. He made more, so he'd handle the money, and wasn't that a relief? Then it was my career. When I got pregnant with our daughter Lily, he sat me down and made what sounded like the most loving case in the world for why I should leave nursing school. We didn't need the money, he said. Lily needed her mother. Why would I want to work exhausting shifts when he could give us everything? It sounded like generosity. I understand now that it was strategy, because the day I left that program was the day I handed him the one thing every controlling man is really after: my independence. My exit. For 19 years, I ran a household on an allowance. I want you to really hear that word, because I didn't hear it clearly myself for a very long time. An allowance. A grown woman with a nursing school education she never got to finish, asking her husband for money to buy groceries, keeping receipts, explaining purchases. I didn't have access to our real accounts. I didn't know what he made. When I asked, even gently, he had a way of making me feel small and ungrateful, like a child questioning a parent. Why do you need to know? Don't you trust me? Haven't I given you a beautiful life? And I had a beautiful life. From the outside, a nice house. A daughter I adored, and absolutely no idea that the ground under my feet belonged entirely to someone else. This is the part I most need the people listening to understand, because so many of you are living inside it right now and can't see the shape of it. What I've described has a name. It's called financial abuse, and it is one of the most common and least recognized forms of control there is. It rarely leaves a mark. It looks like generosity. It looks like a husband taking care of things. But its purpose is to make sure that if you ever try to leave, you'll have nothing to leave with, and no way to prove what you're owed. Greg didn't build our marriage on love. He built it on my dependence, brick by brick, and he built it so carefully that when the day came, I couldn't even tell the judge what my own family was worth, because I had never been allowed to know. And I want to be fair to the woman I was, because for years I wasn't. I used to be so ashamed of how long I stayed, how much I didn't see. People who've never lived it love to ask why a smart woman would let a man control every dollar. But it doesn't arrive as control. It arrives as love and comfort and relief. One reasonable step at a time, each one small enough to talk yourself out of noticing. By the time you understand the cage, you've been living in it so long that the door looks like a wall. If any of that sounds like your kitchen table, please don't waste a single hour on the shame. The shame belongs to the person who built the cage, not the one who was told it was a home. And the day came the way it always does. Quietly, and then all at once. I found out about the other woman the way most of us do, which is to say the last. She was younger, She worked at his firm, and by the time I understood what was happening, Greg had already been to see a lawyer. That was the thing that truly shocked me, later. It wasn't the affair, it was the discovery that while I was still cooking his dinner and worrying about our marriage, he had already been quietly, methodically preparing to dismantle my life with professional help. He'd had months, I'd had an afternoon. What I didn't know then, what I would spend years piecing together, was that Greg hadn't just hired a divorce lawyer. He had spent the better part of a year preparing the battlefield. Money had been moving. His share of the business had been quietly restructured. Assets that should have been ours, that I had spent 19 years helping to build by running the home that made his career possible, had begun to disappear into places I couldn't see and couldn't name. He was doing to our finances exactly what he'd done to our marriage, making sure that when the accounting came, I would appear to own nothing, because I would appear to be nothing. And then came the courtroom. I had a tired, overworked attorney I could barely afford. He had a sharp, expensive one, and Greg's entire strategy, laid out in front of that judge, was breathtaking in its cruelty and its simplicity. He was going to minimize what he owed me by minimizing me. He testified that I had chosen not to work, leaving out that he'd engineered the choice. He painted our 19 years as him carrying a woman with no ambition and no ability. And then he delivered the line that has lived in me ever since. Leaning toward the judge, reasonable, almost sorrowful, he said, "Your Honor, she's never amounted to anything on her own, and with respect, she never will. I shouldn't be punished for that for the rest of my life." I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count. What stunned me was not just the contempt. It was that he believed it. 19 years of erasing me had convinced him it was true, and now he was using the erasure as evidence of the erasure. I sat there, and I felt the judge's eyes move over me, taking in the frightened, silent, unemployed woman in the cheap blazer, and I watched the story land. Because the terrible thing about a lie like that is that it uses your real circumstances as proof. I looked exactly like a woman who would never amount to anything. He had made sure of it for 2 decades. I walked out with a support settlement that was a fraction of what was fair, built on a picture of our finances I now believe was a fraud. I had my daughter, a used car, and a few $100s. And on the courthouse steps, in the cold, Lily, 16 years old, took my hand and said something I will never forget. She said, "Mom, he's wrong about you." I didn't believe her that day. I want to be honest about that. I stood on those steps believing, in my bones, that the most powerful man in my life had just told a judge the truth about me. It would take me years to understand that he'd handed me a map instead. Because a man that's certain you'll fail will never once check to see if you're building something. And I was about to start building. The first year after the divorce was the hardest of my life, and I won't pretend otherwise, because I think the fantasy of the instant comeback does real damage to people in the middle of the slow one. I worked 2 jobs. I cleaned offices in the evening and worked a front desk during the day. Lily and I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment where she took the bedroom and I slept on a pull-out couch for 3 years, and I told her it was because I liked the living room, which she knew was a lie, and loved me for telling. There were nights I sat in that used car in a parking lot and cried until I was empty, because the exhaustion and the shame were a physical weight, and because a small, poisonous voice in me kept whispering that Greg had been right. But here is where the map revealed itself, and it happened by accident, the way most turning points do. One of my jobs, the daytime one, was at the leasing office of an apartment complex. I answered phones, filed paperwork, showed units to prospective tenants, and something happened to me in that office that I did not expect. I was good at it. I understood the buildings. I understood the tenants. Because I understood what it was to be a person who needed a safe place to live, and was afraid of the people who controlled it. I started noticing how the business actually worked, how the money moved, how an ordinary building, managed well, quietly threw off income month after month after month, whether or not anyone was watching. 19 years of being kept away from money had made me starving to understand it. And now, for the first time, someone was paying me to learn. The person who changed everything was a woman named Ruth. Ruth owned a handful of small buildings and used our office to manage one of them, and she was in her late 60s, widowed, sharp as a blade, and utterly without patience for self-pity. She noticed me. She noticed the questions I asked, questions the other clerks never thought to ask, about cap rates and cash flow, and how she'd bought her first property. And one day, over bad office coffee, Ruth said the sentence that reorganized my entire future. She said, "You know, honey, the reason rich men keep women in the dark about money isn't that it's complicated, it's that it's simple, and they're terrified you'll find out how simple." Then she looked at me and said, "You've got the eye. Most people don't. You want to learn this for real?" I want to talk directly to anyone listening who is at the bottom right now, who is working 2 jobs and sleeping on a couch and being told, by the world or by a voice in their own head, that this is all they'll ever be. Please hear me. Rock bottom is not a verdict. Sometimes it is the first honest ground you've stood on in years. For 19 years, I'd lived on a beautiful lie. Now I was living on a hard truth. And a hard truth, it turns out, is something you can actually build on. A lie you cannot. Everything Greg had given me had been designed to keep me dependent. This tiny job, this bad coffee, this sharp old woman, none of it was beautiful. But it was mine. And it was real. I told Ruth yes. And that yes was the beginning of the answer to everything Greg had said in that courtroom. Though it would take years. And though I still, at that point, half believed he was right. Ruth taught me the way people used to teach, which is to say she gave me nothing and showed me everything. She didn't lend me money. She lent me her time, which was worth more. For 2 years, I worked my jobs and spent my evenings and weekends learning the actual mechanics of how ordinary people build wealth out of real estate. Not the late-night infomercial version, but the real, slow, unglamorous version that actually works and that almost nobody has the patience for. My first property was not glamorous. I want to describe it honestly, because the honest version is the useful one. It was a rundown triplex in a neighborhood everyone else had written off, bought with an FHA loan that let me put down a fraction of the price, on the condition that I lived in one of the units. So Lily and I moved into a construction zone. I did what people in the business call house hacking, though I didn't know the term yet. I lived in one unit and rented the other 2. And the rent from my tenants covered almost the entire mortgage. For the first time in my life, I was not paying to keep a roof over my head. The building was paying for itself, and paying me a little on top, and I had done that. Not Greg, me. I learned to do everything myself because I had to. I learned basic plumbing from library books and online videos, standing in 2 inches of water at midnight because a tenant's pipe burst and I couldn't afford an emergency plumber. I learned to patch drywall, to screen tenants, to read a contract, to say no to a contractor trying to pad a bill, to negotiate with a bank in a voice that didn't shake even when I was terrified. Every single one of those skills was a skill Greg had told a judge I didn't have and never would. And every one of them, I earned with my own 2 hands in the dark, while he slept comfortably somewhere, certain I was drowning. There's a specific kind of strength that gets built in a person who has been underestimated for a very long time, and I felt it growing in me those years like a second spine. When you have been told you are nothing, and you survive it, and then you slowly discover you are not only surviving but building, something happens that the people who never doubted you will never fully understand. Their doubt stops having any power over you. Greg's voice in my head, the one that whispered he'd been right, got quieter every time I fixed a thing I'd been told I couldn't fix. I was, without quite realizing it, curing myself of him, one repair at a time. 2 years after the triplex, I sold it for a profit that made my hands shake when I saw the number, and I put every dollar into 2 more buildings. Then those became 4. I was still not rich. I was still driving a used car and clipping coupons and being extremely careful, because I had learned, the hard and permanent way, never to build my security on someone else's promises. But I was moving. And I was moving in a direction Greg literally could not see, because he had stopped looking at me the moment he decided I was nothing. The most dangerous person in the world, it turns out, is the one you've decided to stop watching. And there was something I had never stopped watching either. A question from the divorce that I had never let go of. because I was becoming, slowly, exactly the kind of person who could finally afford to answer it. The question was simple, and it had haunted me for years. Where had the money gone? During the marriage, I'd had no access and no proof. But I am not, and never was, the fool Greg described to that judge. In the last year of our marriage, before I even knew a divorce was coming, I had noticed things. A second phone he was careful about, statements that stopped coming to the house. A new business partner named Phil, an accountant, whom Greg spoke about in a tone he used for very few people, the tone of a man discussing a secret rather than a colleague. At the time of the divorce, I'd tried to raise it. My tired, cheap attorney had asked for financial discovery, and Greg's expensive one had produced a mountain of documents that painted Greg as far less wealthy than I knew him to be. His share of the business had been restructured. His income, on paper, had mysteriously dropped in exactly the year he was preparing to divorce me. I knew in my gut it was a lie. But knowing something in your gut and proving it in a courtroom are two different universes, and the bridge between them is money I did not have. So the judge saw the paper, and the paper was a masterpiece, and I lost. I need to explain what Greg had almost certainly done, because it's one of the most common financial crimes in divorce, and most people have no idea how routine it is. It's called hiding assets, and in a contested divorce it is not a gray area. It's fraud. When one spouse deliberately conceals income, undervalues a business, moves money into shell entities or trusted third parties, or delays income until after the settlement, they are lying to the court under oath to steal from the other spouse. It happens constantly, and it works constantly, precisely because the spouse being defrauded is usually the one, like me, who was kept financially in the dark on purpose during the marriage. The very control that traps you is the control that robs you on the way out. Greg had spent 19 years making sure I couldn't count. Then he used my inability to count as his cover. For years, I couldn't do anything about it. I was too busy surviving, then too busy building, and the statute of limitations and the cost of forensic accounting made it feel like a closed door. But I never threw away my old files. Call it instinct. Call it the same obsessive documentation that had failed to save me the first time. Boxes of marriage-era statements, the few I'd managed to grab, notes I'd made, the name Phil written on a scrap of paper. I moved those boxes from the couch apartment to the triplex to every place after, and Lily used to tease me about them, and I could never quite explain why I kept them. I think part of me always knew. A man that arrogant, that certain he'd gotten away clean, never imagines the woman he erased is keeping a record. And a record, I had learned in 100 midnight repairs, is a kind of power that just sits there quietly, waiting for the day you finally have the resources to use it. That day was coming. But it arrived from a direction I never expected, because before I ever got to reopen Greg's past came for him on its own. By the time I had built my portfolio into something real, more than a dozen units across several buildings, held through a management company and a holding structure that did not carry my name on the front of it, I had learned a great deal about how money actually behaves over time. And one of the truest things I learned is this: the same traits that let a man cheat his wife in a divorce are the traits that eventually cheat him. The lying, the overconfidence, the certainty that the rules are for other people. Those aren't isolated behaviors. They're a character. And character, given enough time, always writes the ending. I want to be careful and clear here that I did not spend those years obsessed with Greg. That's the version people expect, the bitter ex plotting in the dark, and it isn't true, and the truth is more important. For long stretches I barely thought about him at all. I was raising Lily, who got the nursing degree I never finished, which is a kind of justice all its own. I was closing deals and managing tenants and slowly, genuinely, building a life that had nothing to do with him. That's the part the revenge fantasies get wrong. The best revenge isn't a scheme. It's building something so real and so much your own that the person who wronged you becomes, over time, almost irrelevant. Almost. But I kept an ear to the ground, the way you do about a person who once had that much power over you. And the news that drifted back over the years told a story I recognized instantly, because I'd seen the blueprint from the inside. Greg had done well for a while after the divorce. Of course he had. He'd started with everything he'd hidden. He married the younger woman. They lived large. But Greg's whole model was leverage and appearance, borrowing against inflated values, spending like the money was infinite, cutting corners with the same casual dishonesty he'd used on me. He'd built his post-divorce life on the same foundation as his marriage, debt dressed up as wealth. And foundations like that hold, right up until the moment they don't. The market turned, the way it always eventually does. And Greg, over-leveraged and overconfident, with no real discipline underneath the performance, began to come apart. The deals that depended on everything going up stopped going up. The debts came due. The younger wife, who had married the performance, left when the performance ended, which is the oldest and most predictable story in the world. And here is the part that matters. The part that connects back to the boxes I'd been carrying for years. When a man like Greg falls into serious financial trouble, when creditors and courts and bankruptcy trustees start pulling on the threads of his finances, all the careful concealment that once fooled a divorce judge becomes very, very dangerous. Because those people have subpoena power. Those people can see everything. And Phil, the quiet accountant, the architect of where the money went, was about to become a liability instead of a shield. I didn't know all of that yet, the day the application crossed my manager's desk. All I knew, at first, was the name, Greg Merrick, applying to rent a one-bedroom in one of my buildings. The man who told a judge I'd never amount to anything, now needing my approval for a roof over his head, and having no idea the roof was mine. I need to explain how a man goes from that courtroom to that application. Because the fall is the whole point. And the fall was entirely his own doing. By the time Greg applied to rent from a company he didn't know I owned, he had lost the business, lost the second marriage, lost the house, and lost the lifestyle that had been the entire point of the man. The money he'd hidden from me in the divorce, the money that had let him start his second act with a stacked deck, was gone, burned through by the same reckless appetite that had made him hide it in the first place. There's a bitter poetry in that I still turn over sometimes. The stolen advantage didn't save him, it just gave him more to lose. My property manager, a steady man named David who runs the day-to-day of several of my buildings, called me the way he always does, about an unusual application. He didn't know the history. He just knew the applicant's income was thin, his credit was wrecked, there was a bankruptcy in the recent past, and the name happened to match the previous last name on some of my own old ownership documents. Probably nothing, David said, but the name Merrick came up on your paperwork, so I wanted to flag it before I processed it either way. And I sat at my desk, in an office in a building I owned, holding a phone, and felt 12 years collapse into a single second. I want to tell you what I felt, because it was not what I expected and I think it matters. I expected triumph. What I actually felt, first, was a strange, quiet vertigo. Because sitting in front of me was proof, undeniable and concrete, that the story Greg told the judge had been exactly backwards. He said I would never amount to anything. And now the arithmetic of both our lives was sitting in a rental application, and the arithmetic said the opposite, in numbers, in the coldest and most honest language there is. He was the one who hadn't amounted to anything. He'd simply had a head start, built on a lie, and he'd wasted it. I had started with $400 and a branded insult, and I'd built something that could keep a roof over his head. And then, under the vertigo, came the real question, the one that told me who I'd actually become in those 12 years. What was I going to do about it? Because I had power now, real power, the exact kind Greg had wielded over me for 19 years. I could reject his application with a keystroke and never explain why. I could make his life difficult in 100 small legal ways. I could, if I wanted, do to him a version of what he'd done to me. The temptation was there. I won't lie to you and pretend I'm a saint. 12 years of a certain sentence echoing in your head builds up a pressure that wants release. I sat with that temptation for a long time, and what I finally decided surprised even me. Because I realized the deepest revenge available to me wasn't cruelty. Cruelty would have made me his student. The deepest revenge was to be, Precisely and completely, the thing he swore I could never be. A capable, powerful, decent person. The kind of person who could hold his fate in her hands and choose fairness. Not because he deserved it, but because I had become someone who no longer needed his suffering to feel whole. And I was about to get the chance to prove it. Because approving that application meant Greg was going to become my tenant. And a tenant, sooner or later, meets the owner. I approved the application. I want to sit with you in that decision for a moment, because I think it's the most important one in the entire story, more important than anything that came after. I approved it on its merits, giving him the same fair shot my company gives anyone with a rough patch and a plausible path forward. Which is to say, I did not use my power the way he had used his. I told David to process it normally. Greg Merrick moved into a one-bedroom apartment in a building owned by the woman he'd told a judge would never amount to anything. And for the first weeks, he had no idea. He paid his rent to Meridian Property Management. He had no reason to look behind the name. Men like Greg never do. They're not curious about the people they've dismissed. That incuriosity had been his weakness for 20 years, and it was his weakness still. But I knew something he didn't, beyond the ownership. I knew by then that Greg's bankruptcy was not going smoothly. When a man has spent years hiding assets, a bankruptcy is the worst thing that can happen to him, because a bankruptcy trustee is a professional whose entire job is to find money that people have concealed. And unlike my broke, exhausted divorce attorney 12 years earlier, a trustee has teeth. The same concealment that had beaten me in family court was now being examined by people with subpoena power and every incentive to pull hard on every thread. And the threads led back, inevitably, to the divorce. To the year the income mysteriously dropped. To the restructured business. To Phil. I want to speak to you directly now, because if you've stayed with me through all of this, I suspect it's because some part of my story rhymes with yours. Maybe someone once stood in a position of power over you. A spouse, a boss, a court, a family, and told you what you were and what you'd never be, and made it sound like a fact instead of an act of control. Maybe you're still carrying a sentence like that, playing it back, half believing it. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us every day. Because everything I'm telling you comes down to one thing I need you to hear. The people who tell you that you'll never amount to anything are not describing your future. They are describing their need for you to have no future, because your smallness is convenient for them. Their certainty is not prophecy. It's just the last tool they have. And you can put it down. I had put mine down. It took 12 years, but I had put it down. And that's exactly why, when the moment finally came for Greg to learn who his landlord was, I didn't ambush him with it. I'd imagined that ambush 1,000 times in the early years. The speech I'd give, the look on his face. But the woman I'd become didn't want the speech anymore. She'd outgrown the need for it, which is a stranger and more complete kind of freedom than any confrontation could have given me. Instead, something better happened. Something I could never have scripted. Because the trustee's investigation into Greg's hidden finances, the long-buried truth of what he'd done in our divorce, was about to become a matter of public record. And the man who lied to a judge to make me look like nothing was about to discover that the record had been keeping score the whole time. Greg found out I owned the building before the legal reckoning fully landed, and it happened in the most ordinary way imaginable. There was an issue with his unit, a maintenance matter, and I was at the property that day going over a renovation with David. I could have avoided the hallway. I chose not to. Not to gloat, but because I had spent 19 years being made to feel I should make myself scarce in my own life, and I was done, permanently, with shrinking to make a man comfortable. So I was standing in the lobby of my building when Greg came down to speak to David about his unit, and he saw me, and I watched his face do the thing I'll remember for the rest of my life. Confusion first, then recognition, then the slow, dawning horror as David said, without any idea of what he was detonating, "Oh, Greg, have you met the owner?" "This is Nora. She owns the building." He didn't have words. This man who'd always had words, who'd had exactly the right cruel words for a judge 12 years earlier, stood in my lobby and had nothing. And I looked at him, really looked, at how much smaller life had made him, and I felt the strangest thing. Not victory, something quieter and more final. I felt free. I said, "Hello, Greg. I hope the apartment's working out for you. We try to take good care of our tenants." And I meant it, which was the part that I think unsettled him most. There was no venom in it. He had been waiting, I could see, for the attack, braced for me to become him. And I simply declined to. I'd become someone who didn't need to. But the world was not finished with Greg. And this is where the story stops being about a landlord and a tenant and becomes about something with a legal name. The bankruptcy trustee, digging through Greg's finances, had done what my side could never afford to do 12 years earlier. They had reconstructed the concealment. They found the trail of the assets Greg had hidden during our divorce, moved through Phil's structures, understated to the family court. And concealing assets from a bankruptcy court and evidence of having concealed them from a prior court under oath is not a private embarrassment. It's fraud, and depending on the details, it can be perjury, and it can be a crime. The paper masterpiece that had beaten me in one courtroom became, in another, the evidence against him. I got a call, eventually, from a lawyer, asking if I would be willing to provide my old records from the divorce. My boxes. The statements I'd carried from the couch apartment to every home after. The ones Lily teased me about. The name Phil on a scrap of paper. For 12 years I hadn't known why I kept them. Now I did. I sat on my floor with those boxes the night before I handed them over. The same way I'd once sat on a garage floor of a different life. And I understood that the obsessive, wounded instinct to document my own existence, the instinct born from being a woman no one would believe, had quietly outlasted the man who counted on no one believing me. He'd built his whole strategy on the certainty that I couldn't prove anything, and I'd been keeping the proof in a box under my daughter's teasing for over a decade. I need to be honest about what the reckoning was and what it wasn't, because these stories tempt us to imagine a single cinematic moment, and real justice is rarely a single moment. Greg was not dragged from my lobby in handcuffs. What happened was slower and, in its way, heavier. The trustee's findings meant the divorce-era concealment was now documented and official. The assets he'd hidden became recoverable in the bankruptcy, clawed back to pay the creditors he'd also deceived. He faced the full weight of a system that, unlike a family court relying on his own paperwork, could actually see what he'd done. The lie that had cost me so much finally cost him more. And it cost him in the one currency he'd spent his life protecting. It cost him the record, his reputation, his professional standing, whatever was left of the performance, all of it now attached permanently to the documented truth that he was a man who lied to courts and hid money from the people he owed. And here is the inversion, laid bare, the thing I could never have imagined on those courthouse steps 12 years earlier. In that first courtroom, Greg stood before a judge and constructed a person out of thin air, a worthless woman with no skills and no future. And the court believed him because I had no way to prove otherwise. In the end, it was Greg who was revealed to be a fiction. The successful man was leveraged and broke. The honest businessman was a fraud. The husband who gave me a beautiful life had been stealing from me the entire time, including on the way out the door. Every single thing he'd said about me in that courtroom turned out to be a more accurate description of himself. That's not poetry. That's just what happens when a liar builds his whole life on the assumption that no one is keeping track. I did not evict him. I want you to know that, because people always ask, and because the answer is the whole point. He remained a tenant in my building, paying his rent, living in a one-bedroom apartment owned by the woman he swore would never amount to anything, and I was, to the letter, a fair and decent landlord to him. Some people hear that and think I was too soft. They're wrong, and it took me years to understand why. Evicting him would have been me finally picking up his weapon, housing him fairly, holding his fate in my hands and choosing decency, was the one thing that proved, beyond any possible argument, that he had been catastrophically wrong about who I was. He'd said I'd never amount to anything. I amounted to the person who could have destroyed him, and chose not to need to. There is no comeback he could ever make to that. There is nothing to say to it at all. The last real conversation we had was short. He caught me in the lobby again months later, and he was quieter than I'd ever seen him, and he said, "You did all this yourself." Not a question. The same words, almost exactly, that another man in another story might have said with wonder. But Greg said it like a man reading his own sentence. And I thought about Lily on the courthouse steps saying he's wrong about you, and about the years I hadn't believed her, and I said the only thing that was true. Yes, I said, I did. And I went back to work, in my building, and left him standing in the lobby of everything he'd been so sure I could never build. Lily is a nurse now. She finished the degree I started and set down 25 years ago, and at her pinning ceremony, I sat in the audience and cried in a way that had nothing to do with Greg, because by then, he took up almost no room in my life at all. That's the ending nobody tells you about when you're on the courthouse steps with $400 and a branded insult. The victory isn't the moment your enemy falls. The victory is the day you realize you'd stopped thinking about him. That whole seasons of your life had gone by, filled with your own work and your own people and your own quiet, hard-won peace, and he simply hadn't been in them. People ask me sometimes if I'm grateful for how it all happened, and I understand the question, but the answer is no, and I think it's important to say so. I am not grateful to Greg. Redemption stories that thank the abuser for the lesson let the abuser off too easy, and I won't do it. What I'm grateful for is myself and Ruth and Lily and the couch I slept on for 3 years and the midnight water on the floor and the drywall and the boxes I couldn't explain. I'm grateful for the woman who kept getting up. He gets no credit for her. He bet everything on her not existing. She was the one thing he could never account for, because he'd never once looked closely enough to see her. So let me leave you with the thing I most want you to carry. Whoever you are, whatever courtroom or kitchen or conversation someone once used to tell you what you'd never be, that sentence is not a wall. It only becomes a wall if you agree to stop in front of it. Greg told a judge I would never amount to anything, and for a while I let it be the truth of my life. And then, slowly, one repair and one building and one refused temptation at a time, I made it the single most inaccurate thing anyone has ever said about me. He's still my tenant, as it happens. He pays his rent on time, and every month, that quiet transaction says the only thing that ever needed saying, without my having to say a word. If this story meant something to you, follow the channel and share it with 5 people who need to hear it tonight, especially anyone who's been told they'll never amount to anything. Leave a comment about the moment someone counted you out and what you built after. And if there's a story you want to see told here, put it below. I read every one. Somewhere out there tonight, someone is sitting in a used car in a parking lot, believing a lie about themselves, about to prove it wrong.